All right, Shoes.
Yeah, start.
Start. Okay. All right. I want to discuss something that I've discussed in the past because lately, they're printing over notes of my uncle Shiurim, and it's topic some of the thoughts that I had expressed in the past are similar, but with some differences. So I want to discuss it regarding Yom Kippurim, one of the thoughts that my uncle expressed. Now, in Parshas Bereshis, the Torah tells us that by Erev Boker Yom Echad. And the question is, what's the significance? Why does it say Yom Echad, one day? It should say the first day. Why Yom Echad? And the Medrash gives a number of pshatim on it. One is that it's a day that there was only Hakadosh Baruch Hu was there, when there weren't even Malachim there. So it's Yom Shel Echad, a day of one. And then another answer that the Medrash gives is Yom Echad, one day. It's the one day of the year. That's Yom HaKippurim. Now, the question is, and I've discussed it, what is the identity, the connection between Yom HaKippurim and the first day of creation? Man was created on the sixth day. Rosh Hashanah was the sixth day. So, what is the idea of Yom HaKippurim, Yom HaKippurim being identified with the first day of creation? And in the past, I had mentioned that if you take a look at it, if you count from the sixth day when man was created, 10 days, it comes out Sunday. In other words, man was created on Friday. So Friday is one, Shabbos is two, Sunday is three, Monday is four, Tuesday is five, Wednesday is six, Thursday is seven, Friday is eight, Shabbos is nine, Sunday is 10. So the 10th day from the creation of man is on a Sunday. So in other words, it's not talking, Yom Echad is identifying the day that would have been Yom Kippur with the first day of creation. But we have to understand, what is the significance of it? Okay, my uncle doesn't mention that pshat, but my uncle says something similar to what I had expressed. I have some questions. I'm going to try to answer those questions. My uncle said that now there is a minhag, and I have mentioned that also in the past. There's a minhag to go to the mikveh erev Yom Kippur. The main reason that is associated with it is because of Tumas Balkari. People want to be tahar, want to be purified. It's a minhag, a custom. However, the Darkei Moshe, in explaining it, also another reason is given is somehow there is an association between going to the mikveh erev Yom HaKippurim and the mitzvah of tshuva. Matter of fact, many had a minhag. When they went to the mikveh erev Yom HaKippurim, they would say vidui, but the Darkei Moshe mentioned something very interesting. Actually, I find it somewhat puzzling, and I'll explain why. He says, just like by Gerus, when it's a ger goes to someone undergoes gerus, so they go into the mikveh 3 times. Well, they don't have to go in and out, but they put their head underneath the water 3 times. And so there is an identity. There is an identity between uh, between Yom HaKippurim and Gerus. In other words, with the Yom HaKippurim should be identified with the concept of Gerus. And the question is why? Because we say Gershin is Gayer Kekatan Shanola Dami. When somebody undergoes Gerus, in a sense, he is like a new person. He's like a new person. He's born. He's like he was just born. So tshuva, you have to see yourself as tshuva. The Rambam says. My uncle mentions that also. That the Rambam says someone who does tshuva has to say ani eni oseish. I'm not that same person. I'm not that same person. In other words, just like a ger is not who he previously was, so too I always mention that you find that with the Torah, with Yaakov, when Yaakov underwent when Yaakov he had his name changed to Yisrael, but he retained his former identity. Avram, when his name was changed to Avram, the Gemara in Brachos points it out, he does not retain the name Avram. It's just Avram. The question is why? Okay, HaKadosh Baruch Hu called Yisrael Yaakov also, as the Gemara says. But the question is, what is the lesson from that? But the answer is, Avram, it was, in a sense, that perhaps, there's a discussion, but that perhaps could be identified, because that's when he got the mitzvah bris milah of the gerus of Avram. So he became, it wasn't just a promotion. They became the father of the Jewish people, of all future generations, even of the Gerim. Av Hamon Goyim Nisaticha. But it represents a new identity. Whereas Yaakov, even when he got the name Yisrael, which according to Targum Inkelis, emphasized this idea of being a sar, being an officer. In other words, he identified with being an Av of Klal Yisrael, but he still retains, he was a Jew beforehand, so he retains the name Yaakov. He doesn't have a new identity, but in a sense, he is in a higher level. When somebody is appointed, in the olden days, when someone was appointed to a position, a higher position, Yosef, when he was appointed in Egypt to be the Mishnah Lamelech, so he got the name Sofnas Paneach. So the Avos, Yitzhak, I'll have to discuss another time, but they received the new name to identify their promotion. They're receiving a position. Okay, but in any case, so Gerus represents not just becoming on a higher level, but it's a new identity. So too, tshuva has to be seen as a new identity. Now, I asked, it's strange, not the focus of this year, but I've asked many people who were involved in Gerus, and these are people who would advocate that when you went to the mikveh, I think they would, when you go to the mikveh Erev Yom Kippur, you should put your head 3 times in the water, 3 times, to be tovel 3 times, which is based on Gerus. But when they do Gerus, so they'll tell the candidate for Gerus to be tovel twice. Some will do once, but most will say to be tovel twice, to go to be tovel in the mikveh twice. And okay, for whatever the reason, the Besdin that I'm associated with, that they do they're tovel in the mikveh. Ger is tovel 3 times. But the question is, I don't think we'll have time to discuss it. Why should it be? Why is it by Geras it's 3 times, and why it's a minhag? It's not a halacha, obviously. And why is it that it could be based just quickly? It could be based on Rus, the 3 times Naomi tried to get her to reject Yahadus. Okay, whatever it is. So but the idea is that tshuva has to be seen as a form of gerus, of being a new person. I'm not that same person. I'm not the sinner. That was done by somebody else. Now, I want to delve further into this approach. This I did not see this in the notes of my uncle Shiurim, but I think we could use it to understand it. Now, at mincha, so we read the parsha of arayos on Yom Kippurim. And Achremos, the end of Achremos. And the question everybody raises it. Tosas raises the question. Everybody raises the question. Tosas quotes a medrash, but even though the medrash gives an answer, somewhat has to be understood. It did not limit the Rishonim and the Achronim, and even the rabbis till this day, from giving an explanation. Why should we read on Yom HaKippurim? Why should we read on Yom Kippurim the Parsha of arayos? In the morning, we read the beginning of Achremos, and the beginning of Achremos talks about the avodah of Yom Kippurim. That's very appropriate. But the question is, the Parsha of arayos, what does it talk about? It talks about incest. Incest, adultery, the prohibition of incest and adultery. And probably every year, every rabbi probably gives another teretz to this question, and it could be. I wouldn't say that all the teretzim are correct, but some associated with the fact that shidduchim were made on Yom Kippurim, so you had to know what types of relationships were mutter and what types of relationships were prohibited. But I want to suggest, and not disagreeing with any of the other answers, but this is the type of question that you could have added answers. There might be many reasons. There might be many expressions in the parsha that have an association, even though it's not an explicit association, with Yom Kippurim. Now, in regard to, there is a mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem, of sanctifying God's name, dying in sanctification of God's name. And there are 3, the general rule is, and of course there are exceptions to this rule, but the general rule is that only for 3 mitzvos is one required to sacrifice his life. Now, there are circumstances where I should say for 3 prohibitions, not to violate 3 prohibitions, a person is required to sacrifice his life. And there are circumstances or even other prohibitions, demands the ultimate sacrifice. However, the general rule is that for three prohibitions, one is avodah zarah, idolatry. If someone comes to you and says, either you worship an idol, the idols, like the Greeks did in the time of the Chashmonayim, and that was part of the act of the rebellion when the Greeks were demanding of the Chashmonayim that they make a sacrifice to an idol. So one has to be ready to sacrifice their life rather than violate the prohibition of idolatry. And shvichas damim, if somebody says, either you kill this person or I'll kill you, you're not allowed to kill, even though in regard to the other mitzvahs of the Torah, if someone says, violate the Shabbos, and he's not doing it to get me to go against the Torah. He wants me to work on Shabbos for whatever reason. And he says, violate the Shabbos, do this prohibited form of work on Shabbos, or I'll kill you. So you do the prohibited form of work. But if somebody will say, kill this person, my chazis, no, you're not allowed to. And then gili arayos, which is prohibited relationships, certain forms of incest, and also in the adultery. So a person has to sacrifice their life rather than violate these prohibitions. And so these are the three mitzvahs. Of course, it goes without saying that those who fight on behalf of the Jewish people throughout the history of the Jewish people, and even today, and they are sacrificing their lives on behalf of the Jewish people, they are also being Mekadeshim Shemayim, the most glorious manner. But I'm just talking about Kiddush Hashem in order not to violate a prohibition. So and it's very interesting, the Rambam in Perek Hey of Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah, where he discusses the mitzvahs of Kiddush Hashem. And he starts explaining what is Kiddush Hashem. So it says like this: if somebody rises up against you and tells you to violate one of the mitzvahs of the Torah, so you violate the mitzvahs of the Torah, those mitzvahs of the Torah. But he says that's talking about the other mitzvahs. However, the exception is avodah zarah, gil arayos, and shvichas damim, idolatry, prohibited relationships, and murder. There, you're required to sacrifice your life. So the question is, the Rambam here is coming to explain when there is a mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem, when I am required to give over my life. So he should have started off by saying there are three types of mitzvahs that one is required to give over his life rather than violate those prohibitions. That's avodah zarah, gil arayos, and shvichas damim. But the other mitzvahs of the Torah, you don't have to. But he starts off in the reverse. First by telling us in the other mitzvahs, you don't give over your life. And then he says, but the exception is these three where you have to give over your life. It seems very strange. And I heard from my father, because in a sense, there are really two mitzvahs of Kiddush Hashem: sanctifying the name of God through living, and sanctifying the name of God through dying. So the Rambam mentioned the main mitzvah where in the normal situation where we don't encounter these three prohibitions, one is required not to sacrifice his life, certainly according to the Rambam Shita. One is required not to sacrifice his life, because the main mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem is sanctifying God's name through living. And where do we learn it out? However, if a person encounters someone who threatens him with death regarding violating the three types of prohibitions that the Torah says Yarov Val Yavor, you have to give your life over, that's an exception. But the main mitzvah of sanctifying God's name is sanctifying God's name through living rather than through dying. And the truth of the matter is, so before the Torah tells us in the Parsha of Arayos deals with prohibitions of adultery, of incest. There are other laws mentioned there also, but the main part of the Parsha of Arayos deals with relationships, incestual relationships, adultery, which one is required to give his life over rather than violate these prohibitions. So, but in introducing us to these prohibitions, the Torah starts off with Ushmatem es chukosai, you shall observe my mitzvos, es mishpatai, observe my decrees and my laws, asher yasa osam ha'adam, which man shall carry out, v'chai bahem ani Hashem, and by which he shall live. And v'chai bahem is the pasuk from which we learn out that a person does not have to, and according to the Rambam, should not give his life in order not to violate those prohibitions. In other words, if someone says that regarding one of the other prohibitions of the Torah, so you do not give over your life rather than violate those other prohibitions of the Torah. Just these three types you have to give over. So the Torah introduces us to a prohibition from which one has to give over the life by first telling us that most of the mitzvahs of the Torah, you don't have to give over your life. In other words, it's emphasizing the v'chai b'hem, living al Kiddush Hashem. Now, Yom Kippurim is the Yom Kippurim is the last of the Aseret Shemei Tshuva. Yom Kippurim is the last of the Aseret Shemei Tshuva, and the Rosh Hashanah in a more limited way. The whole Aseret Shemei Tshuva, of course, where we do the Aseret Shemei Tshuva, we also do Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippurim. There's a very strong emphasis. We say Kosfenu b'Sefer Chaim, L'man Chelkim Chaim. There's an emphasis on life, and the Chazal tell us that tzaddikim gmurim, people who were tzaddikim from day one, complete tzaddikim, righteous people. So they're written down in the book of life right away. Rishoyim gmurim, but if someone is a rasha, if somebody is wicked, So he's written down on Rosh Hashanah. Immediately, the Sefer in this in the book of death. In the and if somebody is a Benoni, he's in between. So Toli Vomei, his fate is held in abeyance. And all the Rishonim ask, we see Rishayim, the greatest Rishayim, people who kill, who murder, and they live long lives. So how can you say that they're written down immediately, Rosh Hashanah? They're written down immediately, Rosh Hashanah, for death. You see, they live long lives. Certainly many years after they started committing abominations, murder. And we see tzaddikim, people who their whole lives were lives of purity. And they die immediately after Yom Kippurim and after Rosh Hashanah. How are we to understand this Gemara? The Rishonim give many answers. I want to suggest could perhaps fit with some of what some of the Rishonim say. But there are two perspectives to life. You could see life as a process of living. I've mentioned this before. And you could see life as a process of dying. Every day that we live is another day of life. And every day is a day closer, unfortunately, to our death. And I want to suggest that perhaps that when we talk about being written in the book of life, it doesn't just mean, of course, that to a certain degree that might be included in some instances, that I will survive, that I will overcome illness. But it means that I live, my life will be a life of living rather than a life of dying. So I think, and in a sense, and then we have to understand, how do we evaluate a life of living versus a life of dying? And as the Rambam, and sometimes we might have, individuals might have one perspective, what's considered living. Some individuals will consider a wild life as living. But objectively, that's a life of dying. The Jewish people, when they thought that Moshe died, to them, at the time of the Egel, when the Satan made it appear that Moshe was dead before them, so they saw life as a life of dying. And they built the golden calf. Why did they build the golden calf? Because what was the goal of the golden calf? Immediately after they did the ritual with the golden calf. Vayochlu, vayishtu, vayikumu l'tzachek. They ate, they drank, and they got up to be merry. The Epicurean approach of life: eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Indulgence. If life is just indulgence, it's a process of dying. A person, there are people who can live, their whole life could be a process of dying. There are people, even even sick people, that their whole life could be a process of living, and they die only in one moment. So when a person, now, what is our perspective? What is our perspective of what is our perspective of life as a process of living? When do we see life as a process of living? When do we identify it as a process of living? When a child is born, life becomes a process of living. As a matter of fact, we say that, but when as a person gets older, he begins to see very often the natural disposition, not that it should be that way. You begin to see life as a process of dying. Uh, Reb Chaim, he felt that when the Chazal say that under certain circumstances, a person should be Zoche Yom HaMisa, he says that's only under special circumstances, when other approaches are not available. Because sometimes when a person focuses constantly on being Zoche Yom HaMisa, life becomes a process of dying. Not with everybody. On the contrary, sometimes as a result of being Zoche Yom HaMisa, you could turn a life that is a process of dying into a process of living. But Reb Chaim felt that advice was given only for certain situations and at certain times. So the idea of being born again, or renewal, or is identified with the process of life of living, is identified with the process of living. Now, Gershon is Gayaka Cotton Shanola Dummy is identified, a ger, in the sense, a ger's perspective is that he saw his former life as a process of dying. And then when he goes through Gerus, it becomes a process of living. Life becomes a process of living. And the idea of Baal Tshuva is also that the Baal Tshuva, we taught very often, repeat, there's an expression, that was my former life. That's not my life now. I have a new life now. And in a sense, I very often say that the process of Tahara, a person puts his head below the water. It's a medium in which a person can't exist, a person can't live. And then when he picks his head up out of the water, he goes from a medium, from being in a medium in which he can't live, in a sense that could be identified remez-wise as a process of dying, into a process of living. So in that sense, Gerus is Gershon is Gaia Kakatan Shanola Dami, because birth is identified. Birth is, of course, it has halachic ramifications, but birth is identified with the beginning of a process of living, and where so that's why Gershon is Gayer Kakatan Shanola Dami, because it's like it's a new life, it's a new identity, and a Baal Tshuva is the same thing. And the truth is, we could say that the idea, the identification with Geras, as I mentioned before, because we see that by Rus, 3 times she had to show her commitment. 3 times she had to show her commitment for 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 undergoing Geras. So it could be the going to the mikveh 3 times perhaps could be identified to show the nature of the commitment of Geras, the way it should be, and the nature of the commitment that a Baal Tshuva has to do. Of ani eini oseish, I'm not that same person. So my uncle said that's the reason why it's identified with the Medrash identifies Yom Echad, Yom HaKippurim, because Yom HaKippurim represents a new beginning. Now I have a problem with it, but I have an answer also. My problem with it is that why should it be identified with the first day of creation? If it's being reborn again, being a new person, a being like Gershon is Gayer Kakatan Shanola Dummy. So it should be identified with the day of creation of man, when man first began to live. The first day of the week, Sunday. That was the first day of creation of the world. It wasn't the first day of creation of man. But I think the answer is we say in the Slichas, and I've mentioned it. I mentioned it this year also. Hashem kel rachum b'chanun. And we mentioned the name of God twice. Hashem twice. Why? The name Yud Kei Vav Kei, because that's Midas Harachman. That's mercy. And the Chazal tell us that a person needs mercy before the sin, and a person needs mercy after the sin. The Mabit, I remember I saw it in one of the Sfarim of the Mabit. That maybe it's an obvious question. I'm sure many others ask it. Why do we need mercy before the sin? We understand the need for mercy after the sin. I sinned. But now in Pirkei Avos, we say, Lifnei miya ta'asid litain din v'cheshbon. And the question the Gra asks, a very famous question, Brisker Rav gives a different answer than the Gra. Why does it say din v'cheshbon? It should be cheshbon b'din. First, you have an evaluation when you stand in the court. Although lately you see in courts, the judge can start off a trial and say you're guilty. Now we're going to see why you're guilty. I mean, we've had a couple of years ago a case where a judge was not embarrassed or ashamed to say something like that. But we're talking about the Kisei HaKavod. We're not talking about the corruption that exists today in the court system. So din, that's the decision. Cheshbon is the accounting. First, you have the cheshbon, you evaluate the situation. And then there's the din. I wanted to suggest that the idea of din v'cheshbon is that we will be held accountable for the sin that we did. But we're not only going to be held accountable for the sin that we did, we're going to be held accountable but the background of the sin. How did we come to sin? What situation do we put ourselves in before we sin that led us to sin? That's the cheshbon, the accounting. Then has to do with the sin. Cheshbon is how did we come to sin? So we need rachamim, we need mercy before the sin, for the associations we had, for the attitudes that we had. And what's interesting is that when it comes to the din, when it comes to the sin, almost always the sin is the same, irrespective of who the person is. But when it comes to the cheshbon, when it comes to the background of the sin, environment that led to sin, an environment that can lead one person to do Torah and mitzvahs, to be dedicated to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that same environment for another person could lead him to sin. No two people I mentioned all the time. What my father said, God created man in his image with a small h. Each person has his own image. He has his own mission. But Selam Elokim Boroso, and that is the image of God in him. But we're held, so a person, the associations that a person has, that one person will lead him to do mitzvos, lead another person to do to commit sins. Could be the same. Each person is different, but when it comes to the mitzvah itself or to the prohibition itself, it's the same for everybody. And I think that this is the idea. In other words, the world is the environment of man. The environment exists even before man. The environment was created. When a person does tshuva on Yom Kippurim, it's not enough. It's not enough for him to change himself. He has to change his environment. He has to make sure that he will not be again in that environment that led him to sin. And I think, so this is the reason. Creation, the beginning of creation, represents the beginning of the creation of the environment of man. Consequently, Yom HaKippurim, the day when we make ourselves new, it's not enough to make ourselves new. We have to make the whole environment that we find ourselves in as being new, be different. Consequently, Yom HaKippurim is identified with the first day of creation, 10 days after the creation of man. In other words, to emphasize that's not enough to change ourselves. We have to change our environment as well. Okay.
If anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat. So what's the connection to reading arayos on Yom Kippur?
Well, because the mitzvah, I thought I explained it, but maybe I did. The Parsha of Arayos mentions the mitzvah of Chai B'hem. I have other answers also. It mentions the mitzvah of Chai B'hem, of living. Yom Kippurim is dedicated to the idea of life as a process of living. The Chai B'hem is mentioned in that Parsha. It introduces us to the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem, of dying al Kiddush Hashem, by emphasizing the mitzvah of living al Kiddush Hashem. V'chai b'hem. You should live in the mitzvahs of the Torah.
So the main thing isn't the arayos, it's the v'chai b'hem.
The v'chai b'hem is mentioned there, yes. And it's not the main thing. There are many reasons. I mean, there are many other reasons I could give also, but this is one of the reasons that I think is perhaps overlooked. And Yom Kippurim is a time when we ask for life, but it's not just life to breathe, but it means that we should have a process. A life as a process of living rather than as a process of dying. That's for Chayba.
And what's meant by zochel l'kvura?
Zochel Kfura. Where did that come up? That was mentioned in regard to Yafes. What is Zochel Kfura? What did I say? Zochel
Oh, zat
Kfura.
l'kvura, lamisa. Zochel lamisa.
Where did I say Zochel and Misa? I said, did I say? I don't remember even using that terminology.
I am.
Reb Chaim, no, Reb Chaim said, Zocher, Zocher Yom HaMisa, to remember Yom HaMisa. In other words, the Gemara mentions that if someone sees that he's going to sin, so he should say Kriya Shema, he should learn Torah, all kinds of things. But if all of these things don't work, he should be Zocher Yom HaMisa. So Reb Chaim said that that's only if the other approaches don't work. If the other approaches don't work, so then you have to remember the day of you should focus on the day of your death. You know what? You're going to be held responsible for it. You understand? You're going to the day of your death. In other words, because if a person sees life, as a process of if a person sees leading a wild life, indulgence. So the only way so a person should understand that he's going to remember that there's death at the end, because perhaps that he'll be able to change his attitude that way. But a person has to. But under normal circumstance, Reb Chaim felt you shouldn't constantly have this depressive attitude, not to be depressed about that. He was concerned about people. I think this is my understanding of Reb Chaim, that people should not live a life of depression.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Have a Gemar Chasima Tova.